something or other. Oh, hello, everyone. I just see this message. Hangouts on air is going away August 1st. Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with my evolution hour. I still got to find out what I need to paste into the damn new version of YouTube to make it do what I want it to. So there may not be some evolution hours in August until I can resolve that.
Oh man, wow, what a downer. All right, back to something happy and light. We just had a discussion with NephilimFree. Oh, I'm sorry, that was the wrong one. That was yeah. So I linked the video, the discussion with NephilimFree that RJ and I had on Modern Day Debates channel. That's in the description. So if you want to go watch that first, go ahead, have fun. I thought someone's.
It will be 2 hours you will never be able to get back.
I just got a message. Thought it at first said depression after the show. That's not an inaccurate description of what happened. But anyways, so we have now Tony Reed. We managed to capture him and bring him aboard. Hey Tony, how you
doing? An external observer to the mayhem.
It was a great example of why you don't need to even take NephilimFree seriously.
I was hoping you were gonna say that was an example of how creationism taught me real science. We'll let it slide.
Yeah, sorry. You gotta get your straight lines here, Sarah.
Right. Yeah, you're right. When I actually told Neff off air right after we finished, I said, I'd be happy to have lunch with you or something like that. I will never again talk to you about science. Hold me to that, people. Please hold me to that.
Yeah. Well, you were very reluctant to get involved, and for jolly good reason, because Nephilim is infuriating. But I felt that it was there was originally going to be another guy, Bill Morgan, who backed out. He was busy with something, and I had spent quite a bit of time looking in. Morgan is just a hilarious, a data-free guy. He makes Nephilim look like a Rhodes Scholar.
I just want to make sure you said jolly good, right?
Oh, jolly good. Pip, pip.
I just wanted to make sure. Okay.
It's bully. Haha.
Bully.
Did anybody I wonder if I put in a deliberate thing at the end to see if anybody catches the joke of it, the Reunite Gondwanaland call that I put at the end of the video, to see whether anybody spots that.
Too hip for the room, man.
That was a bumper sticker I saw back in the 1970s. That was a plate tectonics joke, because Gondwanaland is the supercontinent that's formed from South America and Africa and all of that.
We got it,
and
RJ.
It was treated like a political statement. Reunite Gondwanaland! Exclamation mark. And I'd always been frustrated that I never picked it up at the time, but I've loved it as an image of what sounds like a political statement is actually a geological one.
Indeed. I think someone could make a joke about explaining jokes, but yes, at any rate.
RJ has jokes with footnotes.
at any rate,
no, actually, you know what? I'm going to tell you that joke is too hip than it needs to be, because you could just say Reunite Pangea and everybody would get the joke. Gondwanaland. Whoever heard of Gondwanaland except for
it sounds a lot, because the name refers to an area in South Africa, and so it's got a kind of an ethnic connection to it, and it resonated. This was at the time of apartheid in South Africa, and so it had just a quirky set of baggage 40 years ago that obviously went like a contrail over everybody's head in 2019.
What was that you were saying, Jackson, about explaining jokes?
I like it. I think it's quite good. It's bully. At any rate. Yeah, I have a shirt that says "Water Bear Don't Care," so
okay.
But so hello everyone who's watching. Hi, Godless Galaxy and Doorknob Head and Scratch and Beej and
give me a thing to the side chat so I can see all of that too.
Yep, here you go, RJ. So what'd you guys think? I'm not really gonna ask. There's no point in asking who won, but did you at least have fun watching it? Did you have as much fun as RJ and I did? The answer is probably yes.
I had fun watching it because it just seemed like it was silly, and it was nice to have somebody there that was you guys that was like a vocal witness to the silliness. It was crazy.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
never.
and he blundered in with all too many straight lines that were just big mistakes, bringing up Chicxulub and trying to argue that it was a big volcanic burp when we have just an astonishing amount of geologic data about the ejecta layer and the impact of all of that. It's just so far behind the curve. I'm not even sure what creationist he was riffing off of on that one, because it doesn't sound like much of the gang that you'd see at ICR or AIG. So I'll probably have to track down, just as a forensic autopsy move, to try to find out what weird little setup did he steal this idea that it was a volcanic burp.
I'm sure he thinks about it on his own. I feel like the things he says are so far out there that he himself comes up with them. Like standing for truth, when Standing says that like Adam would have had more nucleobases, or that if there was a population of people, there would have been more nucleobases, but there was Adam, so there are only the 4. I feel like that's the kind of crazy that exists only in their minds.
That's actually a clue to how they're thinking, because they're taking a weird little truncated data set and then they're actually treating it in their creationist model. And that means they're getting out onto a gangplank that is over a diving board over an empty pool, and they don't know it.
Oh, someone just put in, Michael Apple just said, did he confuse it with the Deccan traps? That's an interesting question.
That's a very good possibility, yeah, because that was simultaneously going on. And actually, there is when the Chicxulub meteor slammed in, it produced a resonant effect that actually, by happenstance, the Deccan traps are on the opposite side of the planet, and those shock waves come through, and there's a bit of a burp in the volcanic activity on the other side of the planet because of the Chicxulub impact. The same thing happened with, I think, a crater on Mars, where there was a giant, or a lunar impact crater or something like that. I remember there's some, it's a relatively rare phenomenon, but if you have a big enough splat, the thing rings like a bell and those waves hit at the opposite end.
Maybe that's what he was attempting to refer to. I don't know. I mean,
that's totally what he was referring to.
Way. CRISPR says, how do you spell DNA, Nephi? I don't answer evolutionist quizzes. Yeah, that was probably the best. That was his way of avoiding every question. Because at the start, he didn't say that. At the start, he would attempt to actually answer questions, and then sometimes we cut him off, and sorry. But he did later on. He just stopped answering questions altogether, saying, I won't answer evolutionist quizzes. I asked him he literally didn't know what a carbohydrate molecule is. It's in the name, carbohydrate, carbon and a hydrate.
And the carbohydrates are probably the worst example. Oh, jump in, Tony.
Yeah.
Oh, I got to be fair. I mean, I was watching it, and when you asked him that question, I was like following along, and I thought to myself, well, I know it's got to have carbon. I know it has to have hydrogen. And I thought, okay, well, at least I know 2. And then when you said there was 3, I was like, probability is going to be oxygen. And I was right. So, he could have put it together. I didn't know what a carbohydrate was.
It's almost like the words are based upon a language where they made the terms match what the things are made of.
Crazy.
Yeah, isn't that wacky? But carbohydrates and formaldehydes and a lot of these elements aren't the components that are the problem in abiotic research. It's some of the nucleotides and some of these other matters in there, because some of this stuff is just formed by natural organic processes and abiotic processes that I don't think Nephi knows about, because he doesn't read much of the actual technical literature.
He definitely reads other people's reviews of it, though.
Yeah. I was having fun in the side chat because there were people that were stomping on my turf. One idiot made the mistake of saying that he thought that Michael Behe had more technical papers than Eugene Koonin.
Yeah, what the heck?
And I go, what? And he said, well, I did a PubMed search. Well, I don't know what you plugged in, but I have dozens of Koonin papers in my bibliography. I actually opened up the damn bibliography, and I think it's like 89. So I don't know what search factors he was putting up. Behe does have a technical literature, but it's all very old. He did some stuff on protein folding and that back in the 80s and 90s. So he has probably about maybe a dozen or so technical papers under his belt, but it's not terribly cutting edge work. And of course, he's curled up into a little ball in the last 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah, Christopher said, what? Yeah, that was a hoot. That was just
Sure.
something. His mantra about DNA as a language, he never really explained what that meant, or that DNA has algorithms.
Well,
or
because he
isn't
doesn't know
algorithms.
what it means. It's a mantra that the fundamental core, which if we had been at a lower temperature in the debate, we could actually have discussed as a topic, is that the creationists envisage that there has to be an intellect behind the coding system of life, because it does the specific-y things. And of course, he goes hyperbolic about outrageous specificity. As everybody knows, in the biological field, proteins interactions are not quite so lockjawed as they would look. And when you look at it at a molecular level, you can see that there are particular folds and bends where some mutations are more variable than others. And that's precisely how new systems form, is because you can have a mutation in one spot that alters its specificity, and they can reconstruct this stuff more and more at the paleogenomic level, another field that anti-evolutionists avoid like the plague.
I actually mentioned a little bit of that when he brought up ATP synthase, which we did a video about, so we know about its evolution, the literal step-by-step evolution of ATP synthase. Well, it's the little cartoons that creationists show, like he did, show it's always this perfect little, whizzing little machine. It's not. There's a large degree of stochasticity to its its functioning.
Yeah,
Tony, you
I
look
think
like you want to say
somebody
something.
criticized. I think
Well, first of all, slow down. You just said stochasticity. And
that's chance.
I get it. I get that. I'm just making sure.
That's one of those fancy words.
I used to, when people would say, "Oh, you got a conspiracy theory? Oh, you got a stochastic theory?" It's just,
I think
that's always been my argument. I just love that you use that word, stochasticity.
Is that if you're looking at the technical literature, that word stochastic will pop up when they won't be using chance. So if you're doing like Google search, this is another reason why you have to be very careful of how you search around for stuff. If you search polystrate, you will get a pile of creationist papers, because it's not for those trees that are stuck up in ashes. No geologist uses that term. They have a completely different terminology for it. So they deliberately want to use proprietary terminology to ease you in the Google search into their little venue.
You're okay. So you're talking about upright fossils, right?
Yeah, like the lepidodendron.
No, I'm asking, is that the correct word?
Yeah, they don't use polystrate.
Well,
I think there's a different.
The layers aren't that. Well, what the creations would say is these are layers that are millions of years old. It's like, oh, this tree was just growing here while the layers are poly. No. The tree was buried. These layers are either they're not.
Pyroclastic flows are a big one, and there's also some from tidal estuaries. I think the Joggins Cliff stuff up in Canada is like that.
They're not that distant in age from each other. The layers.
I did an episode on polystrate fossils, and it was basically what I noted is that all of them seem to be located around volcanoes or coal beds. Materials there, and the materials there are not said to be deposited quickly. Maybe lithified, over time, but they're not deposited slowly. And so that's one of the arguments I made. I wanted to make sure I had the right term. I do believe I mentioned upright fossils, but is that the actual
for the life of me, I can't read, because the geology is a side issue. I'd literally have to look it up. But the word polystrate is not the one that's used in the technical literature, so that anybody hunting for that is going to get onto a completely different sighting. The Yellowstone cases, of course, are just definitely layers and layers of pyroclastic flows, where you're looking at the trees at the very edge of a pyroclastic flow from one eruption that's killed them but not obliterated them. And so they're just sticking up like that, and they don't rot away all that fast. We know how quickly that occurs. So you get more and more ash flows that occur again and again and again, and gradually bury the bloody thing underneath a mass of stuff. We can see that since I shoveled big chunks of Mount St. Helens off my driveway 30 years ago. I'm well aware of the impact of ash.
Yeah,
imagine so.
There was a guy in the 1800s, or the late 1800s, who was studying the lepidodendron, the big upright ones, and one of the things he noted is that they're buried in place, right? The root system is still there, which doesn't really make sense because for the creationists want you to believe that the strata or the sediments were upheaved and then put down, but the trees didn't move. We can see that in how the roots are still intact. It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, that's actually very interesting. Actually, I get that argument all the time. That, well, if they were buried slowly or buried typically, there should be root systems. Is that published? Do you have a like a reference that I could use for that? Because
that's
I get that argument all the time.
One of the ways how they can identify the dynamics of it. And it's not just from these pyroclastic flows. We out here in the Pacific Northwest get tidal waves from the Cascadia Fault. So there's a whole forest that's relatively recent. There's a bunch of dead trees sticking up that you can actually observe, and they're still there. They were pushed upwards when there was a vast geological thing that up the material, and then there was a tidal wave that came in, killed off the damn things, and then later on there's been reforestation since then. And the fact that those trees are still rooted in place, dead trees from, I think, 20,000 years ago, something like that. We're a tectonically busy area out here in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
Apparently. Tony, here you go, right here in the little chat. There you go. In our private chat, and then I'll put it also out here in
Appreciate that.
chat.
Yeah, there's so many topics we could have veered into eventually, about the distribution of why you don't find Precambrian diatoms or any of the things as to why the geologic layers are the way they are, that we could get more eyes glazed over with Nephilim if we ever got to see his eyeballs. He doesn't use his camera.
Yeah, he claims.
There's something messed up with his speech now, and I'm not degrading him for it, but there's definitely something different about his speech that leads me to believe something as bad has happened to him, and I don't take any joy in that. There's something bad has happened.
Well, my tang gets tangled up occasionally too, and I'm just an old fart, so there could be that element.
Well, I mean, I totally understand if you don't want to show your face on the internet. There are trolls out there, people who will dox you and all sorts of things. I have no problem if you don't want to show your face. It's fine. I don't care. But CRISPR says, I love that Neff simultaneously claims that DNA is a language and then says that there is no symbolism in chemistry.
Yeah, well, as we know, DNA is not made of chemicals. It isn't even made of carbohydrates.
Yeah, that's right. I wish I thought of that while we were in the talk. It was just going so fast, and we were hitting.
And I love that bit about his ignorance on the mitochondrial DNA. See, this is an area that isn't really discussed much by young Earth creationists. There's a little bit of it that intelligent designers, Paul Nelson in particular, was bumping into it about 20 years ago, which is they were trying to argue that, well, the DNA code isn't universal after all because there's a bunch of little organisms that have a different DNA. Well, that's a bad thing to bring up because we can see the evolutionary process of how those variations occur. They're almost all of them are in mitochondria, and you can see how they're always in. For those who don't have a quick primer on their DNA, you've got 20 amino acids, and they're coded for by 64 codons, which are all the different combinations of the ATCGs, and there are some that are coded for more triplets than others. And all of these codon reassignments have occurred with the redundant ones. That, in other words, that you could theoretically have designed DNA if there's no relationship between the codons and the amino acids. There's enough combinations, billions of permutations, that you could give every bloody kind their own proprietary DNA. And since they would be making interchangeable proteins, they would all be able to eat and interact with one another, but they'd have totally unique DNA. That ain't what we see. And instead, we now see examples of where some of the one, I think tryptophan or one of the amino acids is one that's got 3 different redundancies. And so one of those has started to switch over because one mutation can convert it into a start codon or a stop codon, something like that. Or a stop codon can be mutated over to something else. And they can actually observe the mechanisms that allow the thing to switch specificity and float along in a new mode before it kicks into the new one. There's technical literature on this stuff. And boop,
no, there isn't.
Invisible.
Fake.
No, there isn't. Yeah,
it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
All that does is just confirm your evolutionary presuppositions,
Yeah.
RJ. Sorry.
The thing I hope that you and I did in this show was to show that when we were asked questions about things, we would be more than just boilerplate, that we were actually discussing details, that we would be discussing names and examples, and we were not shy to go into them. And that over in Nephi's land, he just couldn't help but go back to just tropes.
DNA is a language. DNA is a language.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what he was also. I also don't know what he was talking about with the lizards. He said the lizard species was the island name. I was like, what are you talking about? That's
you who remember the damn species names way better than I can. You know, this is a dangerous buzzsaw for him to bring up around somebody that had studied the material in detail.
Yeah, I found that hilarious. The other thing I found hilarious that he did was when you asked him how he fact checked Sanford, and he specifically brought up the claim that the human species was moving towards genetic entropy, which is based on a misunderstanding of James Crow's work in a paper in 1997. I knew exactly which paper he was referring to.
Yeah.
And it was misrepresented by Sanford.
We'll give a plug for the new Rocks book that we hope to have out by the end of the year. The Rocks were there, some straight science answers to bent creationist questions. And we go into that matter in great detail. And Crow was pissed off by it. He actually said about how annoyed he was that creationists were misrepresenting his work.
I always think it's funny that the creationists believe in genetic entropy, but disbelieve in junk DNA. What do you think the product of genetic entropy would be?
But junk DNA, yeah. Well, junk DNA is one that the intelligent designers, the Jonathan Wells set, really make a big deal out. It's a little bit of a trope in the creationism community, but it's not a cause celeb obsession. But Jonathan Wells and his gang just bang this drum constantly. The problem is that they don't get too close to the data field on that. It's partly a terminology game because a lot of scientists were still using the term to say, well, they thought this was junk DNA, but we're finding blah, blah, blah. The fact of the fact is that there's big stretches of DNA that don't do anything. And the ALUs are just a gorgeous example. And that's why I brought the damn thing up, because I know exactly what creationists have and have not written on it. So I knew I was going to get just crickets but when he would try to deal with it.
Yeah, well, when Alan Cummings, he's one of the people who claims to have coined the term. And when he mentioned that just because it's called junk doesn't mean it's useless. He was actually saying that it could have certain functions, and he went on to name several of them. And so his analogy was more like a junk drawer. Everybody has a junk drawer in your kitchen, but I'll bet you none of it is useless. And that it wasn't coding
for proteins. That was the major point.
Right, exactly.
That still the vast majority of the genome doesn't code for proteins. And this was another thing that threw everybody off. The two big genetic amazements of my lifetime was, one, the realization that there were so few genes compared to the number of proteins. Alternative splicing changed the dynamic entirely. They were thinking that back in the 70s or so, that there would be 100,000 genes for humans because we have 100,000 proteins. There'd be one gene per protein. But then they discovered, nope, alternative splicing, 20,000 genes generate 100,000 proteins, where the same gene data from one direction codes for one protein, from another direction codes for another protein, or that with an intron pulled out codes for a different protein. And wow, this is weird. Then the other one was the homeobox issue, that when they were conceptualizing that a bug, which looks very different from us, would have to have a completely different genetic architecture. And it was really like a gobsmacker when they discovered, nope, homeobox genes, the same front, back, top, bottom, dorsal, ventral, are producing a bug and a human being and a chinorhynch and so they're going, whoa, that's interesting, which has been this whole Evo Devo bit, of which, by the way, creationists don't do any of that work at all.
Go ahead.
So you remember how you felt when you learned those two things? That's
it was exhilarating. Right. Yeah, it was absolutely exhilarating. I love it when I find new information.
By RJ.
Yeah, RJ, dude, you know your stuff, man. I gotta admit that.
Well, I
hate it.
Part, it's old fartism because I've been researching a long time on it, and secondly, I am tenaciously tenacious when it comes to researching subjects that and Jackson knows exactly how relentless I can be on this from writing this book, I don't take anybody's word for it. If I don't understand a subject, I'm going to try to research it until I understand the terminology and the concepts involved, the history. If there's been a debate about how things have changed over time, that was the thing. I suppose I was getting into it at the baby level when I did the chapter on human evolution in the old tip book that I wrote around 2003, 2004. And there's when, at that time, I was just coming off of the period when the single species concept, if you're familiar with that, was fading away in human evolution. They had a ladder of progress, and you can still see it in the typical charts. There's a bunch of people that do TED Talks and stuff saying, get away from this, get away from this. That you have the primate that turns into the next one, that turns into the next one, and then you have Australopithecines, and then you have Homo erectus, and then you have human beings, like a ladder of progress, which would be the case for an individual lineage, but it makes you forget that that's occurring in a shrubbery of cousins and different lineages that may coexist. And that single species concept, that conveyor belt concept, was starting to disintegrate in the 1970s as they started finding more and more and more hominids. And to the point where now, when you read works from the 1960s and 70s, you know, it's like you're looking at pre-plate tectonic geology. You're going, oh, isn't that sweet?
Well, I'll tell you what, dude, I'm looking forward to you guys' book. I just hope it's not a World War II romance.
No. You won't even get a World War II romance in the parallel to Julius Hogg.
Oh, no.
He does the history.
By the way, Tony, do you have my Evolution Slam Dunk book?
I don't. I need to get it.
Well, damn it. RJ needs the royalties, and plus then you'll know all about therapsids and all of that. There's a ton of technical literature on there. What I did in that book was to say, okay, what's an area that hasn't been properly covered in the literature by the anti-creationism literature? To fill a hole, and I go, well, the reptile mammal transition really has not been. It's alluded to occasionally. Most people don't know about it. That dinosaurs are way more sexy. Who wants to care about some dab little fur ball? And the point is, it's us, and it's also a case where I went through. Only about 20 anti-evolutionists even bothered to kind of bump into the reptile mammal transition. And if I ever can do an illustrated second edition, hear that, any publisher out there? That Nephi is going to be in the new edition because he shot his mouth off on the reptile mammal transition. Matthew Sarhardy at Creation Ministries International just did a posting this year on it where he jumps off the gangplank even farther than Nephi tried to, in trying to argue that the genetics of our jaw thing and our ear things aren't the same. They're different from the other vertebrates. Oh, really? No, I'm afraid not. You're really wrong on that one. So yeah, get Evolution Slam Dunk.
No, I have to, because I mean you said the word therapsid, and you had me there because of all the orders on the planet, therapsid is my favorite.
Yeah, well then you're familiar a bit about my favorite, and the one that I bang over their heads with, are the probenignathid. You also got the diarthrognathids. That was the first one that was actually named. I'm going to get you a tickler. That was actually named for Robert Broom, Diarthognathus broomi.
That's how I was in our chat with Bill, where you put up the picture of the scientist shooting himself. That's how I was.
Are you familiar with the jaw transition, Tony?
The what?
The jaw
The
transition.
jaw transition and how we got our middle ear bones and all that.
Oh yes, I did an episode on that.
Yeah,
Actually, my
yeah.
episode on mammal. Yeah, I definitely am.
And if you do any other, then you want to directly call attention to Robert Broom, because although he's more known for paleoanthropology with hominids in South Africa in the 1920s, back in the early teens, he was 1912. He was just mainly a mammal paleontologist, and he was looking at these new weird little synapsids that were showing up that had these enlarged dentary bones and were kind of looking like maybe the group that mammals evolved from. And he threw the gauntlet down in 1912 in a paper that is now actually available online. I was able to get the whole text of the thing. But he was saying that, how can you get from an articular quadrate to a dentary squamosal and be functional all the way through? I know you just love those terms, don't you? This is like paleontology porn.
No, these are the obvious questions.
I mean, that's the question Tony thinks about all the time. Plagues his mind.
Yeah. How do you get to squamosals? I mean, come on.
Yeah, exactly. But the main thing is how can you shift the jaw articulation and remain functional? And he realized that you had to have a thing where the original reptile jaw hinge was operational, and then the bones morphed around in both the skull and the jaw in such a way that a new exterior masseter muscle forms that's pulling in tandem with these others, and then gradually takes over the role of the jaw hinge, and that frees up that old articular quadrate to be pulled up into the middle ear for hearing, which happens a lot where jaw bones get modified for hearing in reptiles and others. And the fact was that he said, not only is this the possible way, it's the only possible way that this could occur and be natural. Well, God apparently was listening and decided to make all of these critters that were doing exactly what Robert Broom predicted they did. I think that's not very plausible.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Or either that or God really loves evolutionists.
And yeah, actually, by the way, I did actually mention it because I had to look it up. Believe it or not, I put this in my episode, but yeah, I don't remember everything I've written and done. But yeah, I did mention Robert Broom, the Procinosuchus, a few other ones. Yeah, the molars and the incisors. Yeah.
You remember from our talk with Bill that I was shown my own evolutionary medicine video and I forgot that I made it. So
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I did bring up that stuff about the dentary bone. I decided to deploy that little bit of information because it's not widely known about why the dentary bone before the jaw ear shift. Why did the dentary bone get so damn big in these synapsids? Well, they were insectivores, and they had little backwards pointing teeth. And so there was a tendency towards getting narrower and narrower and narrow because the act of biting down with an insectivore, they don't need a strong bite force. When they bump onto a bug, the very act of chewing pulls the bug into the mouth and they get their dinner. And the longer and narrower the jaw is with more and more little itty bitty teeth on them. So there's now a selection pressure for an insectivore to have a long, narrow dentary arcade. And that's before you get to that thing. Now you have this dominant dentary bone and this kind of wimpy little articular quadrate that then gets joined by something that improves the dentary connection. That makes it even easier for biting down on the bugs, but it doesn't have to be strong because it's eating bugs. And there's a huge amount of technical, and they've even done a bite force analysis of Probatognathes, where they were showing how the trade-off between the strength of the jaw versus the shape of the jaw. It's just wonderful stuff. And no creationist was paying attention to any of that crap.
It was
okay. So it's only now that I realize something from my childhood. I had a dentist's office, and they actually had video games there, and I shit you not. The name of it was the Dentary Arcade, and the fact that you mentioned it has just made me laugh my ass off from my childhood. By the way, just so you guys probably noticed, I have a fetish for being wrong. And Old Scratch commented that my video on therapsids was good enough for him, but I left out the double jointed jaw. So
I thought it was a good video.
There, yet another mistake I made that season.
Well, you know,
the one thing.
I you know what, the only one I put a question in on one video which you did address in the comments, but it didn't make it to the errata, and I was kind of sad about that. Not to be confused with your erotica. It was a question about the Cambrian the Cambrian explosion episode, where you had a clip of Richard Dawkins talking about it, and he's like, "Oh yes, it seems like it was very rapid." And I posted because I had read The Ancestors Tales, a fantastic book where he spends a fairly large section talking about the Cambrian explosion. And he at the beginning he starts it out with that. He's like, "Oh yes, it looks very big, but it was very rapid, but," and then goes into all of it. But I've seen that clip where the creationists are like, or they just kind of take it and they're like, "Haha, even Dawkins
Yeah.
admits it looks very
It's
rapid."
a negative. Oh yeah, well that
Right.
pops up in the intelligent design literature. It's just a ubiquitous one. But
You're killing me though.
notice,
What was the question, man? What was the question you had?
Oh, sorry, I forgot. I'm sorry, I got off topic. The thing was that you never came back to the Dawkins quote. You never explained well, I mean, by watching the video, you inform the viewer that the researchers in the relevant fields are say, okay, no, it wasn't actually as rapid as you think. It wasn't, and there also was no evidence of intelligent design. But it's like, I don't know, maybe if it was putting like the Dawkins quote like in the actual context, I don't know. But I think the video is still great overall. I thought it was wonderful.
No, I'll answer that. I don't think I did. I even answer it. I don't think I did. Ultimately, I don't care what anybody's opinion is. If you're going to tell me that obviously dogs came from wolves, I'd be like, well, I mean, unless you're showing me evidence for it. And anything that Dawkins says, it's not above reproach.
Right.
Everything you say, James, is not above reproach. Same with you, Jackson.
There was a really nice series that was done on,
I have the boot button.
BBC or whatever, but they had a bunch of zoologists that would be going through looking at fierce critters, basically, and squids and all sorts of things. And they had Dawkins on as an almost perfunctorily useless talking head, where he would be discussing paleontology, which is not his field. And
we don't have to be mean to Dawkins.
Well, I mean, Dawkins has definitely had his contributions to biology, but I mean, ultimately, he serves more as a science popularizer, and I don't think he's better than either the two people I'm talking to.
I was just being funny because RJ knows I like Dawkins, and RJ's a Gouldian, so
I'm a Jay Gould guy here.
Well, I like them both. And
I mean, I've read 5 of Dawkins' books versus 1 of Gould's, so is what it is.
Well, I kind of grew up on him in the 80s, although I was already an adult by that time. But his columns in the Natural History magazine were just exhilarating, annoying, but always thought-provoking. Nobody could string together more semicolons than Stephen Jay Gould. There's no doubt about it. But he was thought-provoking and pugnacious in a way that Dawkins' stuff wasn't. And I know from the dinosaur area that I literally paid no attention at all to Dawkins because Dawkins did nothing that bumped into it.
He doesn't. He mentioned 3 dinosaur taxa in the 700-page Ancestors Tale. He says, "Oh, by the way, these are dinosaurs." Moving on.
Yeah. And the fascinating thing now, of course, is the chronology thing, because remember, dinosaurs are just kicking in at the same time that the first mammals, the first full-blown placental mammals are arriving, right at the late Triassic. And why that dynamic, the mammals didn't disappear, to contrary, they stayed and hunkered down and became very increasingly successful all during that period, even though the dinosaurs took off. But even the dinosaur radiation is turning out to be very interesting. And some creationists have riffed off this stupidly, that you have them, that there was a whole sea of teeter-totter style little critters running around that were almost fully upright. But then the one group that finally started kicking off were these full-blown vertical upright dinosaurs. And they just proliferate, a relatively small number of models, but they really start taking off. And the extent to which there's a climate issue, there's an extent to which there may be a metabolic difference. We love to know what gut microbia differences there were, that you have no way of knowing a lot of these little fiddly bit things that were probably very dynamic differences when you're talking about why that particular group of teeter-totter bipeds took off and their rivals faded away.
Well, I'm disappointed that there's not a single word in that I had to go look up.
I am really backsliding now, Buster. I'm going to have to get more dialogue, more sophisticated here. What we know what we can do to screw up Kent Hovind, just start talking about lacustrine.
I'm just saying that was actually a compliment, because I mean, my goal on my show is to try to make things so understandable that if you have no scientific expertise, hopefully you'll understand it. And you have a habit of going way the hell over my head. And just there, you explained something so well that I don't think anybody missed it.
I'm usually up with RJ. Sometimes he gets ahead of me, but I'm usually there with him listening. But also,
that's why I love it. Like when Karis is in the live chats on my show, I'm delighted with it, because there she gives a completely different perspective to where I say, what does that mean? Well, if I can't explain it, then I don't understand it. So I should be able to explain it in a way that otherwise you don't understand it. And I don't think Neff can. You can see if you try to get him to apply his rhetorical flourishes to actual data, he just falls apart.
Yeah, it was very obvious that he has read nothing on any of these. The quote mines, he had a bunch of little quotes from, he's like, oh, I pulled these from secular scholars about language. It's like, okay, fine. I can do a Google search and look up, DNA as a language and find a bunch of examples. So what? What does that mean, though? And we tried to get him to explain that, but symbolism is not in chemistry, but it is.
Here you are, a creationist, and he's not a young one in the sense of being like 20. And theoretically, he could be thinking about all of these things. He would realize that Adam and Eve supposedly existed 6,000 years ago. Noah and the kids were around 4,000 years ago, that every one of them would have a set of DNA. And then there would be population splaying off of them, and that this would apply to all these organisms. What would be preventing him from trying to figure out what he thinks was going on, unless his brain doesn't do that? And that's the thing that you find in all anti-evolutionists, 100% failure rate. They haven't really thought through what they think happened. I call it the map of time problem. It's one of my core defining characteristics of Tortukans, that they have a cartoon of what they think happened, but it doesn't really translate into detail. For intelligent designers and old Earth creationists, they literally never bother filling in that giant time frame they accept. And then the young Earth creationists are the opposite. You should be able to think through, okay, the flood occurred on October of 2350 BC. What was going on a month before? What was going on a month after? What was going on at that time where I was here? What would I have seen here? That was the thing that separates the real scientists from the dilettantes. All the way back to Nicholas Steno, if you're familiar with him, the guy that he was a friar, priest who was fascinated with the geology around where he lived in Italy. He was the guy that came up with that superimposition theory, that the idea that the stuff on the bottom has to be older than the stuff on the top. Duh. And he wanted to figure out what his local neighborhood was. All the people that were the pioneers of geology were fascinated with what was under their own feet. Nephi lives in a absolute fog bank of rhetoric and doesn't apply it to anything. There's no curiosity.
Well, I will say I learned something every day, and today I learned that Tortukan meant ever pertaining to tortoises and turtles. That's awesome. I love that. Thank you.
I had to coin a word to describe something that didn't have a word. Otherwise, I wouldn't have coined it. I just and I come from that Stephen Jay Gould spandrel tradition and exaptation. He would just coin words to mean new things. I wanted to describe what it was if you have a mindset that had an ability to be overly addicted to secondary sources. It was like an impervious mine shell that had a very narrow frame where all you're looking at is just this tiny little tunnel vision. It was like a turtle. It reminded me of it. I didn't want to call them turtle mines because I didn't want to insult the poor turtles. So I looked around and found that Tortuga, which is the Latin for turtle, is virtually nobody uses it. I think there was a video game that had a Tortuga land, and Tortuga comes as an island that's off of a cognate of it in Spanish. And so I thought, yeah, okay, Tortugan. I use that as a proprietary term.
We did coin one, well, we have coined one term in the book so far.
Yes, monocausism.
Yeah.
Whoa.
That's the
Okay.
tendency to try to find a single cause for what is probably a multi-cause phenomenon.
Yeah.
And there's an awful lot of that.
Monocausism.
Yeah, I was asking
Yeah.
because I or RJ and I figured it out because like the way we do it is generally like I'll draft the chapter, then RJ will come in and insert the second half
And wreck it.
right. And so I was writing it the first part. I was like, what's a term if you're looking for just one cause to explain a whole bunch
Nobody
of
had a term for it.
So yeah, monocausism. There you go.
No, I've had many conversations with RJ where I've said, here's something we discovered. And he's like, oh, yeah, that's everyday stuff. In fact, scientists do that every day in a lab because that's how you get cars. And I'm like, what the hell? That's what it's like to be around RJ.
Yeah, you don't have to tell me twice.
Well, in fact, that monocausism thing, Jackson rather quietly, mousily put it in a footnote. And I said, no, up in the main paragraph. I like that. This is something we want to have people read.
I do. Okay. That actually, speaking about language, just reminds me. You made a comment during the talk about fractal wrongness.
I loved that. That was awesome. Fractal wrongness.
Yeah.
I had to, that came to mind because in the concept, it's like everything you say is so wrong that everything that comes off of it is also incredibly wrong. So it's like an infinite wrongness, you know. And so everything.
For those of you who do not understand the fractal concept, that comes from Mandelbrot sets and such in mathematics. That you have certain formulas that are recursive in nature. If you want to get into this, I still recommend, if you've never read Gödel, Escher, Bach by, oh God, I can't think of his name off the bat. It's one of the most mind-boggling works done, I think, in the 1980s. You can literally come into it. You'll learn about Bach's music and Escher's paintings and Gödel's indeterminacy theory and mathematics. It's just mind-boggling. But anyway, Mandelbrot came up with this particular set that at every level of resolution is the same. So if you home in on it, it gets bigger and bigger, but it's still the same little curlicues, no matter how far you go, and it literally goes on forever. Or if you back up, it is still the same structure, no matter how far back you go until you get out to the whole structure. So it's infinitely complex from, I think it's like y = 1 over x or something like that. So it's absurdly ridiculous iterative formula that's producing. But something that is fractal is something that repeats a structure layer on layer on layer, and tree limbs are like that, you know, where the limb comes out and there's another little micro limb and another little limb, and finally you got leaves on it. They have fractal phenomenon. Sea coasts are fractal in nature. One of the things that Mandelbrot once joked was, how long is the coastline of Maine? And it turns out that it's infinitely long.
That's the coastline problem. Yeah, I watched a video on that a while back. It was intriguing.
My thing is that you didn't bother to stop and define Tortugan for anybody, but yeah, you had to define fractal. What the hell?
Well, I did define Tortugan. It's somebody that lives under that little mine shell. And the thing about it is that it doesn't involve content. It's not a claim that you're stupid or smart. It's not a claim that you're religious or not. It's not a claim that you are politically liberal or politically conservative. No, those are not variables. It's only the ability to not think about things you don't want to think about, to never change your mind based on new evidence, to be addicted to secondary sources. If you have a mind that can do those things, and we make it a big deal in the new book, and I did that as well in Slam Dunk. If you have a mind that can do all of those at once, you are going to go off the rails. And creationists and flat earthers and anti-vaxxers and ideological communists. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people with a lot of different ideologies, but they're all Tortugans. And the little Tortugan alerts.
Yeah, we actually compared in the book Ken Ham, who is a Christian conservative, against Noam Chomsky, who is a very very liberal atheist. They both have Tortugan ruts in their mind, not the same ones, of course, but they both do.
That's why I got a whole chapter in Susan Jacoby's Age of American Unreason. This is one that when you find out about it, you go, what? Noam Chomsky was in the 70s. Noam Chomsky was denying the Cambodian Holocaust.
Jeez.
Yeah,
Yeah, geez.
it shocked me too because I was actually I for a little while I was quite enamored with a lot of his stuff, and so
Oh,
when
there's
I
a
found
lot of kids on college campuses I bump into that are just, and Lawrence Krauss is positively hero worshiping. He studied under him. And of course, the most dangerous Tortukans are the brilliant ones. They get into politics. Don Rumsfeld is a very brilliant Tortukan. Dick Cheney was one as well. They're articulate, they're clever, they're extremely good at making an argument and offering evidence for things. But it's when you start scratching the source level that you start seeing those deck stacking traits and the data selection and the data avoidance parts. And brilliant people are often able to do that with remarkable facility.
Well, without getting political here, I just got to say, it'd be really nice if you made an argument for Mitch McConnell being Tortugan.
Oh, he is physically visible, the embodiment of a Tortugan. You know, he not only walks the walk, he looks the part.
Okay, all
at
right.
any rate, moving on.
Yeah, moving on.
Do we have any? I'd love also questions from the audience. Whoa, we have a creationist in the audience.
Awesome.
Well, the fossil record shows all creatures fully formed Cambrian explosion. Actually, I did 2 videos on that, which I told you to watch the other day. Clearly, you did not do that because
and orphan genes.
Yeah, orphan genes. Not on your side. Not on your side.
I'll take the Cambrian explosion part. Of course, by definition, every organism at all times during the history of life is going to reach that reached adulthood is reaching adulthood, and it's going to therefore be fully formed. Even Stephen Jay Gould would use that term. It's fully formed. What do you expect it to see? Like a partial thing sticking up? No, organisms don't do that. They end up being vital, fully functioning organisms. The issue is, what kind of organisms are there? And here's some little trick questions that you can give for your bar fights with a creationist on the Cambrian explosion. Bar fight question number 1, to ask them how many phyla have their fossil record traceable back to the Cambrian explosion. You know what that is? It's only about half. That you've got of the 35 or so animal phyla, only half of them have a fossil record at all, and not all of them trace back to the Cambrian. And some of the ones that do are evolutionary ancestors. And my favorites are the chelicerates and the chordates. We're chordates, but the chelicerates, those are your spiders, scorpions, and horseshoe crabs. The critters that are identified as the chelicerate phyla in the Cambrian don't even have the chelicerate yet, the little wiggly parts. That's because they're evolutionary ancestors that you don't find fully formed, actual full-blown chelicerates until way later. That's because there was an evolutionary sequence going on. Now, the chordates, that's another one. I caused deer in the headlight look from Casey Luskin when I brought this up to him quite a few years ago at a thing in Seattle about what were the chordates that evolutionists were expecting very early chordates to look like. And it turns out what we find are exactly what they were predicting on evolutionary grounds, that they were going to look like lamprey larvae, that they are not things with jaws and all the stuff that we're familiar with. No, they're little wiggly little things that look like the embryonic form of a tunicate. Are you familiar with tunicates? Oh, they're fun. They're little bag-like sessile
Did you give him time to answer?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with tunicates, Tony?
No, I was thinking of a much shorter answer to that, which is, once you have a replicator, you have a fully formed replicator. From there on, I mean,
there you go. Yeah.
Everything after that is just an addition. But I mean,
in fact,
what you said was good too.
Yeah, the tunicates are really fun because you get into this thing of where exactly do you draw the line? Tunicates are little bag-shaped filter features that are
gosh,
my hand's bigger. They're little itty-bitty little creatures, and they live as sessile organisms on the seafloor, but they have a free-floating larval-like form that is their larval form. And I love the line that, oh God, I can't think of her name right off the head, but she said that when the little thing settles on the floor, it eats its brain just like an associate professor earning tenure. And and so it actually literally dissolves its own brain and reuses that material to make its little adult form, which it does this. and filter feeds. Well, the tunicates are regarded as just the closest cousins to the chordates. And even in Jonathan Wells's listing of phyla in Icons of Evolution, guess what we find in the section on chordates? Tunicates.
Really?
That he literally includes them in the chordate phylum.
Yep.
He functionally accepts that evolutionary state. Now, nobody looking at a tunicate in either its larval or adult form is going to think vertebrate.
Yeah. How crazy.
There's what seems to have happened was, well, originally the thought was that there was like our ancestors were sessile because tunicates were at the base, and then they became free living, and then you had the cephalochordates and then the vertebrates upward. But it turns out that's not the case.
I gotta ask, how do you spell tunicates? Because I'm actually looking at it.
Oh, Tunicates, MOUSE. I'll put it in the thing.
MOUSE. Okay, great. I got that part.
Tunicates. There we go.
But yeah, it turns out that cephalochordates are actually further down, and then you have the urochordates, the tunicates, and then you have the chordates. So it turns out we actually their ancestors were free living and then became sessile later, secondarily.
Yeah. Now the other delicious issue is what's going on with these damn homeobox genes that I mentioned earlier about they're the body plan genes. How early do they originate? Because all living organisms are descended of complex organisms are coming from a bunch that's really starting to develop in that Cambrian period. A few predated. And maybe God, what the hell are the ones that maybe came in the Ordovicians? I can't think.
The bryozoans.
Bryozoans.
Yeah.
But the thing is that was there a proto-HOX system, and what did it look like? Well, that's all paleogenomics. They've got to try to reconstruct this stuff from way back. The interesting science question that I have is, are you familiar with the Ediacara biota?
No.
They're the weird. Yeah. Oh well. Okay.
I've got like 8 other questions before that, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Let's get in your Wayback Machine to the Cambrian, which is about 520 million years ago, and then jump back another 80 million years or so to the Precambrian. There's these weird little critters that are named after this spot in Australia, the Ediacara deposit. And if you read the technical literature, they don't always call them animals because they're not all sure they're animals. They're not sure what some of them are. Some of them look like little floor mats, and some of them look like weird things that might look like sea pens, and there's a strange bunch in there. So they're often referred to as biota. And the thing is are they animals? And in fact, just the most recent papers suggest that this one that looks like the bath mat, Dickinsonia, that's about 3 feet long, and I think some may have even gotten to be a bit bigger. But they are apparently showing enough signs of musculature to indicate that they're metazoans, and therefore probably are using homeobox genes.
Oh, well, I mean, they were determined. I'm pretty sure studies that are
early deuterostomes.
Well, I'm pretty sure studies that are ontogeny demonstrated that they were, maybe bilaterians.
Yeah, and so they're regarded as the very base of that. And there's some brand new material. Briggs and others are the ones that are doing a lot of technical work on there. And there's another little fancy word that I like to popularize, and I do it in the book, and I do it in another place. Lagerstätten. It's a fancy German word with an umlaut that refers to deposits that are extremely detailed, that have just fantastic resolution. Those are really rare. Archaeopteryx comes from a Lagerstätten. The earliest well-preserved bats come from the Meso-Lagerstätten. There are 3 Lagerstätten in the Cambrian, which is really weird. They're all equatorial, so they're looking at just a slice of things. The Burgess Shale that's now up in British Columbia was down in the equator at that time. So also for Sirius Passet that's now up in Greenland. And then Xinjiang, which is in China. They were all down in the equator in this bowl-shaped supercontinent. We don't know what's going on everywhere else. But the thing is that you've got to figure out what's going on with these homeobox genes and what was going on with this Ediacara biota, what was living farther back that's invisible because they're too small to show up without a Lagerstätten, and there aren't any Lagerstätten class deposits going on in the Precambrian. You've got this bunch from China, Duchanteau, I think it is, where it can preserve stuff up to about 0.5 millimeter. So it gets a bunch of little sponge embryos and stuff, and maybe some metazoans, but because they're only half a millimeter or less when they phosphatize, we don't know what they grew up into. So there seems to be a whole ecosystem that's going on to the side of these organisms that we don't know anything about because the fossil record doesn't have Lagerstätten to preserve them. And there's another mystery organism, Claudina, that looks like a little tiny little tube, looks like a little candy, and it's a little calcification, and there are little boreholes often in them, which suggests something's trying to bore in to eat it. We don't know what's inside because there's no Lagerstätten. We don't know what it is that's boring the hole. Whatever it has an ability to go, but we don't know because we don't have any Lagerstätten. So there's a whole ecosystem that's going on. Well, the fun part is, did these Ediacara biota use homeobox genes or not? If they did, then that pushes the homeobox genes way back into the Precambrian. Or would they be using a weird proto-HOX version? And that's why they are built differently than the stuff we see later on. They have odd ways of bifurcating components that are very different from what we see in the standard bilaterians. And so there's a lot of these things that theoretically the scientists can work out the idea of the can theoretically retro-engineer whether or not homeobox genes or some combination of them could generate the forms that we see in the Ediacara biota. And I can guarantee you that Jackson may be young enough to live to a point where they do that, and no creationist will have done that work.
Okay, but your Ediacara biota argument notwithstanding,
yeah,
I got to make sure. I'm really scared about something. You mentioned the HOX genes.
Yeah.
How dumb did I sound when I called them Hox genes?
People say
they are
genes
called that.
the
Yeah, they are often just
Hox
called
genes,
that for short.
Hox genes. Yeah.
Yeah. They
Okay.
say Hox for short. Homeobox genes for long, because Hox is shorter. They spell HOX.
I feel the same way when I have to pronounce genes for the videos, and it'll be like a short word, and I'll be like, "Oh, do I spell it out? Do I just say it?" You know, I have the exact same kind of thing when
it's a toss up. It's like no one would say DNA for DNA because that makes a terrible word. But HOX, I tend to call them that because when I'm an old enough fart that I can remember when they were first discovering these things, and holy moly, was it deliciously exciting. They really only started to identify them in the mid 1990s. And then it just kicked off like busy beavers on things. And so it totally revolutionized how we approach the issues of how organisms form stuff. And you find these layers on layers of genes that when you try to think about what would be early forms of chordates, what would be early forms of insects, arthropods and others. Ironically, one of the papers that creationists have riffed off of that just came out just this year is about trilobites. That when they started looking at the amount of variations, if you're familiar with trilobites, they're the critter that's most known in the Cambrian because the little bastards were little buggy things that had shells. And they were
the roaches of their time.
They were the roaches of their time, yeah. And they were incredibly dominant, and they would molt. So you were often what you see as trilobite fossils are the molts, and they would often be doing so. You'd have these masses of of trilobite molts as they moved on to the next layer. They had a long run. They only died out, I think, in the Permian period, which is about 250 million years ago. So they had a hundreds of millions of years run, but eventually
we all know when the Permian was. Come on.
Yeah, we all. It's like I was just discussing that, over a sandwich in the bar about the Permian. That's the thing that, the Permian pops up for me because that's a period knee deep in the reptile mammal transition. That period when the synapsids haven't quite become fully mammal. That's in that Permian period, and the synapsids, the ones with the single jaw opening, as opposed to the diapsids that are the ones that lead off to dinosaurs and reptiles and all that crap. And those openings are used for muscle attachments. So the synapsids had comparatively weaker jaws, but they were suited to the climate of the period, and they were the dominant land animals. Dimetrodon, the little critter that you see in the dinosaur movies, they usually slap a fin on the back of a Gila monster. Dimetrodon is a synapsid. It's on our side of the fence. and you
Yeah.
still find them popping up in dinosaur
I
models.
I
also
will tell you this. I was
I
out
also-
talking to some girls, and they happened to have a toy of a Dimetrodon, and they're like,
Mhm.
"Yeah, this is my little dinosaur." And I was like, "No, that's
No.
not a dinosaur. That's a synapsid." And that
Yeah.
was the end of the night for them.
you got laid
Just
that
so you
night,
know.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Failed
No, I got
pickup lines.
late
No,
with a
that is
T,
not a
not a D.
dinosaur.
Yeah.
Oh.
So
Yeah.
just letting you know. And by the way, the Permian is like, for me, one of the most fascinating periods of time. I'm surprised you didn't mention the extinction at the end of it, but that is.
Yeah, it was the worst one.
the-
95%.
please,
It was
please
the
don't-
great
no,
die-off.
no. He will keep going.
I know. I dug my own grave, but I mean, how often do I get to talk to this guy? Come on.
I mean, you can
Well,
always.
I love talking to you, RJ.
And remember the Siberian traps. The main driver of the mass extinction was that super volcano that was burping off up in Siberia. And indeed, if people read tip 1.2, where I go into the mass extinction issue, 3 of the 5 mass extinctions correlate with megaplumes. So they are a much more important driver of mass extinction than asteroid splats.
I have a question. Tony, you said you had a bunch of questions. I'm interested to know of.
Yeah.
of any.
Shut up, Jim.
Oh no, I first of all, I forgot what most of them were, but I mean, they're not stuff that I'd want to bring out on. I don't want to slow down the discussion.
Oh, I mean, we can go anywhere or nowhere.
Oh, yeah. Nothing slows us down.
Wait, hold on. Tony, do you think Eric went to your museum because of your videos? That's by Beach Price.
Oh,
I don't have
Will.
a.
That was Bill. That was Bill Ludlow. That wasn't Tony's museum.
Yeah. And Eric
Yeah, I
with
don't have
with
a
a
museum.
plain C, no H. I would love to have some interactions with Eric. He's a classic secondary head nodder. If you look at his things, he listens to creationists and goes,
I don't think he's. I think we were talking about that on Bill's channel. Is Kent? Well, there are creationists out there, definitely. Like probably maybe Ken Ham and Georgia Purdom, who do believe what they're saying. Kent and Eric Hovind, I'm not so sure. I think they're probably just in it.
See, and I'm charitable. I say Tortugan alert that everything about their behavior is completely consistent with them believing everything they are saying, and they just are dull as a sack of hammers. That they, when you look at them from a source methods direction, these are ones that are parasitizers. Eric is a little glitzier than his dad because he's learned how to do more of the videos, but everything that comes out of his mouth is repeating stuff that he's troped from people he never fact checked.
Hey, let's do a debate sometime. Who's more charismatic? I would argue that Kent is more charismatic than Eric, but you seem to disagree. Let's do that.
Oh, charisma, there's a different matter. Yeah, he has a kind of Mormon prophet in the toaster kept too long, but he has a gift of gab. He's had a very long tradition. Remember, he came up from the circuit of going around preaching. And so he has the patter down. Some of the times when you look at his really old videos, he's got like about 10 geriatric people in the audience listening to him, but nevertheless, he's got the patter down. Eric is not really a street preacher type. And you'll notice that he tends to like to work with sidekicks, whereas Kent is a solo guy. He works on his own thing where he can control the narrative and present the things the way he wants to present. But Eric is in a different media savvy modern point of view. He's more congenial. He's better looking than his dad, although that's not difficult. So there's a different dynamic going on there.
RJ throwing shade.
Sideburn.
Damn.
I look like Machiavelli, so I'm not. I am making no claims to being other than an old fart.
I don't know. I think you look all right, RJ.
Where do you go from there?
I'm watching the creationist in the side chat make claim after claim after claim, and it's kind of funny. Brought up the Cambrian explosion, then kind of jumped from that, then brought up coelacanths. We actually did a video.
Oh yeah,
I did one too.
And the video stasis, where we talk about how there isn't actually all that much stasis. And he says I can show you guys quotes from famous evolutionary scientists admitting the fossil record has no evidence. I guarantee it's going to be Gould and Eldridge quotes, and you're misunderstanding all of them.
Oh, and Irwin, and there's a whole slew. Colin Patterson. Everyone's going to troll. If Tony, if you get slam dunk, you will want to read the section where I dismantle Colin Patterson's blundering on evolution evidence. And in fact, Christine Janis, the paleontologist, found that because she knew him personally, and she said, yeah, dead on, that was exactly the thing. Could be really obtuse at times. And you'll find out about how his views fit into Claydism, and he was an extreme form of Claydism that was extremely rigid, that nobody uses it today. And so you'll find out about all the backgrounds of all of those things.
Okay, the only problem I have with that statement is use the word if. Yeah, I'll definitely get your book. I will definitely get your book. There's no if. It's when. And
I will do a shameless plug. What I'd love to do is you get my book, and then we have a thing. You get a thing on your show where we talk about it, and we can go through and your reactions to it. And all that
it'll be my next show, but I mean the show I have right now is it's so subversive in what it is. But the next one, is definitely going to be more upfront, and definitely, I'd love to do that. Definitely,
it's a little tiny book. It's only got 2,300 sources that run on for 100 pages in the bibliography. It's just a little tiny thing.
Okay, well, let me just tell you that I've read Kondrashov's work, and then I read his book, but I had to pay $97 to get it, and it was really
my book is way cheaper than that. Yeah, I think it's like $20 at Amazon.
I'll take it. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, and available in all ebook formats.
Oh, S Global just brought up orphan genes. I guarantee you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Oh, I had a fun. In fact, I had. Because young Earth creationists kind of avoid orphan genes, there's very little apologetics on it, except kind of through the back door. It's really Paul Nelson, who's an intelligent design advocate, although he is a young Earth creationist. And it happened, ironically, it was a creationist on
RJ, really quickly, because when I see the orphan gene argument, it's expressed exactly as we're seeing it, where it says orphan genes. But I never hear the actual argument about orphan genes. Can you present that first, and then go ahead and eviscerate it?
There are a bunch of genetic algorithms that are used to detect genetic similarities. And so what they would have is a bunch of ones where they would see genes that don't apparently have a homologue that shows up in the algorithm. Doesn't mean it didn't evolve. It just is they can't see immediately how it could, from what it evolved. And these are invariably ones that are, if the gene originated a long time ago, or went through a period when there were lots of little miscellaneous mutations in it, or another factor is it was a lateral gene transfer that came from a bacterium, that if you didn't search the bacterial databases, your organism won't show a homologue because that gene doesn't normally come in an animal. It's from a bacterium. And so there's a lot of different ways that these algorithms would show up that. Now, what was fun is that gradually evolutionists have been working out the origins for these genes and how they come from transposons and transposons play a great deal of things, of where a thing pops up, retrotransposons, of where RNA is pulled in because of bacteria and that again. And the fun part was to see Nelson and Buggs, who did a chapter on it, Paul Nelson and Richard Buggs. Richard Buggs is an actual geneticist. He's kind of flirting with intelligent design. Anyway, he did a chapter on it, which wasn't defending any anti-evolutionism, but it was just on orphan genes, saying, oh, these are mysterious. And of course, it's written with Paul Nelson, who thinks the Earth is 6,000 years old. I only found out about it because a creationist rammed it down my throat in absentia, because he was bringing up Buggs in a discussion. I think it was on Matt Herron's website or one of these others. And in looking up the link that he gave, it was about Buggs talking about orphan genes. And in that, Buggs linked to the PDF of his chapter he did with Nelson. So I had literally not known about it until the creationist inadvertently waved me into it. And holy smokes, was it an interesting paper to look into, because the evasions, the avoidance of the data field in the sources they brought up, the tiptoeing around the mechanisms that were producing orphan genes were just spectacular. Jackson, you have read the thing now because I sent that off to you. I said, oh, I got to do a thing on orphan genes.
It's true. We did. We put it in the chapter 4, which is all about genetics.
It was a big rewrite.
Yeah, that chapter itself is big. Because we take down Purdom, we take down Tompkins, we take down Hodge, Bodie Hodge also, because he's kind of an idiot. He really doesn't wade a whole lot onto the data field. So I think for the most part, Purdom probably wrote the chapter, and then maybe Hodge made a few little tidbit
big Alinsky too. Oh, I had a lot of fun with Alinsky E. coli experiments. That's another area where there was just a pile up of young Earth creationists. Purdom was just skirting the subject, but there were others who just made the mistake of trying to dive into the details. You heard the same kind of stuff from, if you've seen a lot of Standing for Truth debates, he lambastes Alinsky with these things. Well, it's all a micro mutation, and it didn't produce a new organism and all that. And we go into all the things of why that wasn't to be expected, but it was still delicious examples of how even a trimmed down thing without any damn plastids in it was able to adapt very quickly to a variety of ecological circumstances. And so what you're seeing, and all Alinsky was trying to do, was do a baseline of what does the very basic kind of E. coli do without any complicated things. So the little plastids that are the little organelles inside that act as drivers of evolution because they're ways of exchanging information and bringing in new stuff, none of those were in their organism. So you're seeing that baseline. Even that is generating the kinds of things that you can see how a mutation isn't necessarily benign or bad. A mutation can be simultaneously good or bad depending upon what its context is and what it's connected to. And so a lot of the calculations that Tompkins and company were doing to say, oh, you've got the deleterious mutations and then you have the positive, and then or Nephi talking about the neutral ones. What does that mean in practice? Oh, it's way more complicated, even in little E. coli.
I agree.
Okay. By the way, guys, I really want you to talk about your book. I mean, I'm not moderating this. Obviously, it's all Jackson, but I mean, I really want to. No, hold on. I want to know about this book. I want to know what the name of it is, and I want to know. Hold on, let me finish. Jackson, I want you to explain what it is in as many words as you want. And RJ, I want you to explain it in 30 seconds or less. Go.
Oh boy, that's a tough thing.
Our book is titled "The Rocks Were There," and the entire point of it is to effectively dismantle. Originally, this started off as just a debunk of the first New Answers book, which is Answers in Genesis, attempt at answering the critics in essence. The problem is it does a crap job because the questions are malformed, the answers are terrible. They're not even really answers most of the time. So what we did was we started off with just the first book, then we realized that there were 4 of them in total. So we've integrated sections from each of them dealing with evolutionary biology, paleontology, and geology, and we're synthesizing
and astrophysics.
Oh yes, even a chapter on astrophysics. We're synthesizing
Twinkle, Lyle Star.
Yeah, we're synthesizing all of that into one book that will, in essence, give you a totalizing view of the entire creation evolution debate.
Yeah,
that is what it does. And so we've chopped it into chunks to do that. The first chapter kind of gives you an overview.
About 14 chapters, I think, at the moment is what we're clustering at, and we're about halfway through at the moment.
Okay, RJ, your turn. 30 seconds or less. Go.
It will be simultaneously, for people with technical interests, discussing a colossal amount of science information that will be cutting edge, including papers that have just popped up this year and the last year. So it won't be a dated thing. And then it will be demolishing not only a slew of creationists from top to bottom, but a mass of intelligent design advocates who have stuck their foot in their mouth on some of these same issues. So it is a shredder of massive proportions that will be a work that all critics of creationism will want to have on their shelf.
62 seconds. Okay, good enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, the book we the first chapter is kind of an introduction to science. We even talk about the reptile mammal transition in the first chapter. The second chapter, we destroy their arguments regarding radiometric dating, because I think that's a good place to start, or we both think that's a good place to start. Then we spend an entire chapter on AJ Monty White, because he flies all over the board, and it was worth going through his as one chapter, because there's a lot of stuff that he kind of fields. Then we cover the genetics arguments put forth by, as we said, Purdom, Tompkins, a little bit of Bodie Hodge. Then the chapter 5 is going to be the takedown of baraminology. Yes, chapter 5 will be the takedown of baraminology.
Nice.
We are going to shred the idea.
Depending on the strangeness of kinds.
Hey, Beach Price is asking why the title "The Rocks Were There."
Oh,
can I take a stab?
I bet you can figure out why we're doing that.
Go ahead.
Because the thing that Ken Ham always asks, were you there?
Ding, ding, ding.
All right, the rocks were there.
Yep. So I can't remember where I got that, and I feel bad now, but I heard someone say that at some point, and I thought it was a fantastic rebuttal, and so it deserves to be.
The moment Jackson suggested we do the book, I said, "Oh yeah." It took me 0 seconds to agree to it, because I had to put some things on hold, because I was going to work on a book on the Discovery Institute Descent from Darwin list. That was the next thing on my plate.
How dare you?
I realized the moment Jackson brought it up and thoughtfully said he was going to be writing most of the chapters, thank you very much, that it meant that we were going to be able to take on the Answers in Genesis gang head on in an area that has not been properly analyzed. Tompkins and Jensen and a lot of their point people who have scientific credentials have gotten only sporadic criticism online and very little in terms of book content. And we felt that it was important to fill that gap in the same way that I did on the reptile mammal transition. And we're going to do it. Yeah. And so they're not, Ken Hovind is not going to like this book. Ken Ham is not going to like this book. Nephilim will repeat what he has to say.
Yeah, when we started, we were either into chapter 3 or chapter 4. It was relatively earlier on, and we had our talk with Mike Riddle on this channel, and that was a hoot. Yeah. We are also roasting him. He got roasted quite a bit
in the book. Oh yeah,
in chapter 3.
You get these deer in the headlight moments. I've had interactions with Riddle before, and they're a slightly older, grizzler version of Riddle was up, and we had a perfectly pleasant conversation with him. He's an extremely amiable person, but dull as a sack of hammers. He has zero curiosity. And I asked him about a paper that he had quoted on the radiometric dating of diamonds from 2009 or 10 when I first bumped into him, and he hadn't read then. He copied it from Andrew Snelling. And I asked him again now in 2018, did you read that paper? And no, he still hadn't. I hate to clue you in, Mike, but Snelling misrepresented the contents. And I know this because I wrote the author and investigated all of this stuff. And so I know what all the facts are. And you just don't bother to research all these things, do you? And you still had just this little cloud around his head.
Yeah. He couldn't even tell us. I asked him, I said, is the kakapo related to the sulfur-crested cockatoo? So they're two different parrots. And he said, I don't know.
By the way, the parrot is a species of parrot that has formed a masseter-style, mammalian-style muscle. It's the only one of the diapsids that's done that. And lo and behold, the same gene structures, BMP and the various ones that are involved in that. I allude to that in that book that you're going to be getting, Evolution Slam Dunk.
Yeah. It's chapter 4, what was that? 4, 5, 6. RJ's working on chapter 6 right now. I'm just finishing up on the section. I finished up vestigial organs and then moved on to the boogeyman, Ernst Haeckel, and recapitulation. And that one is just a delight to do in, because there's a whole stack of material that I had accumulated over the years on the Haeckel embryo issue, of which a lot of it comes from the intelligent design community, not the young earth creationist one. So we are just hitting off. We've like the kids
given a carte blanche thing at Costco to just go in and get everything we can. And we're not restricting ourselves on there. And so we want to make it that it will be a one-stop work that will be a major inclusion into the field, the same way I was hoping to do with Evolution Slam Dunk. Information's out there, damn it.
It's funny you say that, James, because I did a video on Heckle's drawings, and the best source was creationist sources. They, for some reason, that was the easiest place to find original sources, was the creationists.
Oh, well, now, if you look at Michael Richardson, and he's done a ton of work on this field that we're going to be discussing over the years, where they've had to kind of retool their view of him. First of all, there's some quibbles about just who was doing what with drawing fudging. And whether or not he really wasn't doing it, it was some of the people that copied him later on that got into copies and all that. So they're not necessarily original. Heckel himself was actually a very meticulous artist. And some of his material on Radiolaria and that are just fabulously detailed. But these damned Heckel embryo things got blown out of proportion, in part because they were not absolutely accurate, and they were fudged to fit his ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny notion that each organism recapitulates the adult form of its ancestor, which nobody thinks is the case. And so everyone goes poo-poo on that. Textbooks often would put the drawings in and then call attention to the fact that he got his theory completely wrong. But the problem is, starting by the 2000s, the modern textbooks don't use Heckel's drawings. They don't need to use Heckel's drawings. They got photomicrographs of these things. And you still find the intelligent design gang in particular saying, how dare you use these pictures that are clearly modified versions of Heckel? No, they're from the photomicrographs. And you should have known this, because Richardson, in his damn letter to Science in 1998, put pictures of them up and called attention to them. So good gravy, take a look at the reason why Heckel's bad drawings look so much alike is because even without his fudging, the embryos look alike. And it's hard to tell the difference on these damn things. He could see.
All right, for those who haven't read the book, spoiler alert.
Yeah, it's what's funny is that some of Heckel's drawings were near perfect. Like his drawing of the echidna fetus is near perfect. And so it's kind of
like, wasn't it just like 2 or 3 that were repeated? That's it?
Yeah, there were relatively few examples of complaints about him. And in fact, in the papers that the creationists avoid citing from Richardson that were done after, they're very parsy about which ones of these little papers they cite. That's the thing that drives me nuts about people like Nephilim, where if you look at them citing a technical paper, you have to wonder why that particular paper. Well, one of the things I'm doing in my tip project, in my master spreadsheet, is I keep track of what papers get cited by anti-evolutionists. So often there will be a creationist and they'll wave a technical paper at me, and I'll look at my bibliography, check my spreadsheet, and go, there's a little black box next to it. They're using that paper because that's one that they've cribbed from a secondary source. They got it from one of the creationist literature. And so I can see how much of the actual technical literature gets cited. By the way, out of 9,000 anti-evolution sources written by some 2,200 people, that 95% of them don't cite primary sources. Of the 5% who do, 2/3 of those are getting them from secondary sources. And of the tiny threadbare bunch who do, they are citing only about 15% of my data field, which is a little itty bitty 27,000 technical papers that I've accumulated so far. And that's only a subset of the full data field. So as a rough heuristic, I can declare as a measurement that anti-evolutionists missed 90% of the data field. Ta-da!
Ta-da.
Well, I can't say I have 20,000 plus papers, but I can say that in my adventures in actually doing the scientific research, that's been my observation too. If they're citing their sources, they're misrepresenting them, and you can easily show them that by just actually citing the actual paper itself.
Looking the original sources. And here we, as pugnacious critics, have an enormous advantage that we didn't have when I was starting out this project in the 1990s, or even as late as 2008 or 9. It's that the vast majority of the technical literature, like we pointed out to Nephi, is available freebie online somewhere or other. I don't have to guess at this. I, as an impoverished scholar on Social Security, cannot afford to buy these bloody things. So I try to find spots to get at them. And so much of the technical literature is available that when a creationist cites a technical source, look it up. And if you can get the full text, read it and find out where that little quote mine came from and what was in the paragraph before and what was in the ellipsis and what was in the paragraph after and what was the conclusion. And then you start discovering, wait a minute, they're leaving out data. Ooh, this is way more detailed than they were implying. And you'll only find that out if you read the sources.
I've been looking up the quote because Global cited a quote, although I won't post the quote, from Dawkins saying that the DNA code is digital and he won't post it. And I don't think he's actually.
Well, it depends on.
He did say that,
but I found it.
He did say that in
Well, I found it. River Out of Eden.
Okay,
right
yeah.
Here. You have to go to bacteria to find our distant cousins, and even then the genetic code itself is identical to ours. The reason it is possible to do such precise calculations on the genetic code, but not on the anatomy of both plants, is that the genetic code is strictly digital, and digits are things you can count precisely. The river of genes is a digital river, and now I must explain what this engineering term means. Oh, would you look at that? He actually goes on and explains it.
Yeah.
It sounds
Clearly,
like it does digital in the computer
since
sense.
all of DNA is A, T, C's, and G's, in principle, you can use information theory to study the A, T, C's, and G's. That's why all of those algorithms can analyze whether or not things are homologous or not. And then you can find out what things have altered during those things. Then the thing is that not all the DNA is the same. That mitochondria have mutated some of the codon assignments, and so you get some little fresh wiggles in there, and we can see the evolution of that as well. So that in every instance, what I've been finding in researching for this book, if you're ever familiar with old Martin Gardner, who used to do science stuff in Scientific American years ago, and he still did a classic book, Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. It's from the 1950s. It's available out there that if you ever need a thing on Velikovsky and flat earthers and hollow earthers and just the early things of psychic phenomenon and stuff, it was just a hilarious takedown. But anyway, at one point in Scientific American, he said, if you want to know how little you know about a subject, start writing a book on it. At that point, you discover that the kind of stuff you would put in a blog or an article won't cut it at the book level, that you have to be far more serious. You've got to deal with issues, that if there are things that have been criticized, you've got to cover that. You got to make sure that you make a solid argument. And I can tell you from my interactions with Jackson, we make a formidable son of a bitch team.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah. I'm still reading.
He has every time I have had the honor to proofread and comment on his videos, I am always finding stuff where I have to say, I got to check my bibliography again. There's some stuff in here I don't have that he has touched in areas.
It seems like it seems like what he means by digital. It's very intriguing, very weird. I would never use this. I would never use this terminology because I think it's kind of confusing. But it seems that he's just saying, like you said, it's countable, it's understandable.
Now, remember, Dawkins is the guy with the selfish gene metaphor.
I mean, it's a weird way to put it.
He kind of denied was a metaphor and now says was just a metaphor. So he has a certain tendency to get wiggly in that area. The other thing is, of course, that DNA analysis only makes sense within the context of how it does stuff in an organism. And one of the things that's so pathetic about the intelligent design movement, if you've ever bumped into any of Bill Dembski's stuff, the design inference and no free lunch and all of that, he prattles on about Mount Rushmore and Scrabble tiles and all sorts of abstract applications, but never genetics. And after all of this time, he has never been able to apply any of his complex specified theories to actual DNA. And I would contend, because he can't, that the kinds of models that the information the sorts want to fiddle with when it comes to actual DNA doing stuff, that they can't deal with it. If you were to give them a long string of 1 billion base pairs, and it's either of a viable organism or one that can't possibly be alive because there are so many little things in there that the genes would never function and it would never form organs, you know, you could theoretically contrive a DNA code that would be impossible as an organism. I don't think that Dembski and that gang or any creationist would ever be able to tell the difference between those two, that they would not be able to tell how they would detect that. And that's because of the problem with coding in general, that there's a famous thing at the CIA of a code that somebody put up for one of their big code guys back in the 40s or 50s, and it's on a monument in public, that they say, decode this. It's a code. Tell us what's in it. And code breakers have been banging their heads on it for decades. Nobody can figure out what the code means. That's when you're literally telling people that there's a code there and daring them to decode it. Well, what if you don't know there's a code there? Can you tell the difference between coded air quotes information and uncoded air quotes information? No. And there's a whole branch of coding philosophy that says you can't really identify that unless you know it contains information, air quotes. You can't determine if it has information ahead of time, because that's not how information can work. Well, you're still in a rarefied world compared to what DNA does, which is translating the codons into proteins and regulators that turn them on and off, and homeobox genes that deploy the regulators, and a whole mass of interacting things that are now so complicated that your supercomputer is going to have steam come out of it. And that all of that ultimately produces biological systems that change over time in ways that we can experimentally deal with. You'll notice that Nephilim in the video tried to bring up the chicken embryos, the chicken archosaur things. There was a recent paper done where they retro-engineered, they pulled the genes back that turned the archosaur dinosaur snout into the bird beak.
Oh, yeah,
and
I remember that.
That was a paper done, Buller's work, I think, from, I think 2015, 2014, somewhere around
Yeah,
there.
it was a little while
It's
back.
a fabulous example of paleogenomics, and I allude to it in Evolution Slam Dunk that you can get at Amazon.
Well, at any rate, we've been talking for
oh gosh, yes,
a while.
I've been going on and
on. So I think what has it been, an hour and a half, something like that. So I think we're gonna cut it. Yeah, we probably could go all night.
Yeah, it's midnight where you are. Still shank
yes,
the evening for me.
Yes, we could. It's Saturday night. What?
Saturday night's all right.
Yeah.
So at any rate, thank you guys for coming on, and thank you everybody in the chat for watching. And so we're going to close this out, and we should have a video on the structure of DNA up pretty soon. So wait for that. All right,
Tony, I'm looking forward to having a nice book chat with you, because I think we can cover a hell of a lot of fun topics.
And I think I can dumb it down for most people.
All right. Well, have a nice night, everybody. Bye.